An elite trooper of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, the feared Imperial Marines, crouches behind the roots of a banyan tree, his hand gripping the cold steel of a Type 30 bayonet. For years, the doctrine of close-quarter combat, the absolute dominance of the blade, and the unyielding spirit of Bushido had made his unit the undisputed masters of the Pacific night. But as the pitch-black darkness of the Solomon Islands settles over the swamp, the familiar sounds of the jungle are suddenly replaced by the low mechanical cycling of specialized automatic weapons. From the mist emerges an entirely different breed of warrior, the Marine Raiders. These Americans do not retreat from the blade, they actively seek it out, moving through the impenetrable undergrowth like ghosts, armed with devastating short-range firepower that shreds the darkness in seconds. The Japanese elite had always believed that Western soldiers lacked the stomach for close-quarter savagery, yet they now found themselves systematically hunted by a unit that thrived in the chaos of close-range slaughter. Why did the most fanatical, blade-trained elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy learn to avoid close combat with the U.S. Raiders at all costs? What terrifying realities shifted the ultimate masters of the night into a state of defensive paralysis? In the early months of the Pacific War, the Special Naval Landing Forces, often referred to by Western intelligence as the Japanese Imperial Marines, held an unbroken reputation for absolute lethality. Trained rigorously at naval bases such as Kure and Sasebo, these men were not standard infantry. They were the spearhead of the Empire of Japan's rapid southward expansion, elite naval shock troops conditioned to operate in extreme conditions, execute complex amphibious assaults, and dominate the enemy through sheer aggression. Central to their tactical identity was the absolute cult of close combat. Imperial Navy doctrine placed fanatical faith in the power of the jukendo, the art of the bayonet, and hand-to-hand combat, operating under the deeply ingrained belief that Western soldiers, accustomed to modern comforts and reliant on material superiority, would break and scatter when confronted with cold steel in the dark. In the early months of the Pacific War, the Japanese forces routinely infiltrated Allied perimeter defenses after nightfall, bypassing heavy machine gun emplacements to plunge into Allied foxholes with bayonets fixed to their long Type 38 rifles. The psychological impact of these night attacks was immense, creating chaos, panic, and rapid retreats among defending forces who struggled to organize a cohesive response in the pitch-black jungle. To the Japanese High Command, hand-to-hand combat was not merely a tactical maneuver, it was the ultimate equalizer against superior Allied artillery and industrial power, a domain where willpower, blade skills, and fanatical determination reigned supreme. However, as the campaign turned to the rugged, mosquito-infested jungles of the Solomon Islands in mid-1942, the Imperial Marines encountered a force specifically engineered to meet them on their own terms. Formed early in the war under the visionary officers like Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson and Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Elson, the Marine Raiders were created as elite light infantry commando units. Drawing inspiration from British commandos and Chinese guerrilla tactics, the Raiders were meticulously selected from the toughest recruits in the Marine Corps, put through brutal physical conditioning, and trained extensively in swamp survival, silent movement, night fighting, and knife combat. Unlike conventional Allied units, which relied heavily on defensive perimeters and heavy artillery support, the Raiders were designed to operate independently deep behind enemy lines, launching sudden raids, ambush incursions, and aggressive night patrols. They were stripped of unnecessary equipment, trained to navigate the densest rainforests without relying on clear trails, and taught to view the jungle night not as an obstacle, but as cover for lethal action. When these two elite forces finally clashed in the suffocating humidity of Tulagi and Guadalcanal, the Japanese Marines expected to face soft, hesitant defenders. Instead, they stepped directly into a trap laid by a ruthless enemy that welcomed the brutality of close quarters. The fundamental crisis for the Japanese Imperial Marines emerged from a total asymmetry in close quarters doctrine. While the Japanese soldier was trained to close the distance to deliver a single fatal thrust with a long Type 30 bayonet attached to a bolt-action rifle, the Raider Marines approached close quarters combat as a high-velocity math problem. A raider did not look to engage in an honorable duel of blades. His objective was to deliver the maximum amount of kinetic energy into an enemy in the absolute shortest window of time. The raiders recognized that the thick undergrowth of the Pacific Islands naturally reduced engagement distances to less than 15 feet, a range where a bolt-action rifle becomes dangerously slow, and a bayonet charge can be utterly obliterated by a single pull of an automatic trigger. Furthermore, the raiders completely dismantled the tactical reliance on rigid hierarchies that often slowed Japanese decision-making on the battlefield. Carlson's raiders introduced the revolutionary concept of gung-ho, a philosophy of absolute equality, open discussion of mission parameters, and decentralized command. Every single raider, from the lieutenant colonel to the private, knew the exact objective of the mission, the layout of the terrain, and the fallback positions. In the chaotic, fragmented environment of a pitch-black jungle skirmish, where officers were frequently killed in the opening seconds, this lateral flexibility allowed individual raider fire teams to adapt instantly, changing their fire sectors, flanking advancing enemies, and coordinating defenses without waiting for orders from the rear. For the Japanese Marine, accustomed to the absolute obedience of the imperial military structure and the predictability of traditional frontal assaults, this fluid, hyper-aggressive style of warfare was profoundly disorienting. When Japanese infiltration teams attempted to creep through the lines to launch surprise hand-to-hand assaults, they found that the raiders were not sitting passively in their trenches. Instead, raider patrols were actively pushing out into the dark, setting sophisticated interlocking ambushes along the very paths the Japanese intended to use. The realization that their most elite shock tactics were not only anticipated but actively countered by an equally aggressive enemy struck a deep blow to the operational confidence of the Special Naval Landing Forces. As the campaign progressed and casualties among the veteran Japanese naval units began to soar, field officers were forced to reevaluate their entire tactical approach to the American Marine. The early assumption of Western martial weakness had been utterly shattered by the relentless lethality of the raiders. Reports filtering back to command headquarters painted a grim picture. Engaging the raiders at close range was no longer an opportunity for a glorious breakthrough, but an invitation to absolute annihilation. While tactical agility and mental conditioning laid the groundwork for the Marine Raiders' success, it was their specialized arsenal of high-volume firepower and brutal close combat weaponry that truly terrified the Imperial Japanese Marines. The Japanese Type 38 Arisaka rifle, while accurate and possessing low recoil, was over 4 feet long, stretching to nearly 6 feet with its fixed Type 30 bayonet. In the dense, vine-choked jungle, maneuvering such a long weapon was agonizingly slow. The raiders, by contrast, entered the brush armed with weapons explicitly engineered to saturate tight spaces with a storm of heavy lead before a blade could ever be raised. At the absolute center of this firepower revolution was the Thompson submachine gun. Chambered in the crushing .45 ACP caliber, the Tommy gun delivered a devastating rate of fire that completely transformed close-range jungle engagements. Japanese combat doctrine relied heavily on the shock value of a sudden bayonet rush from the bushes at distances under 20 yards. But when Japanese Marines charged out of the darkness with screams of banzai, they were met not with scattered rifle shots, but with continuous, bone-shattering streams of automatic fire. The heavy .45 caliber slugs possessed immense stopping power, tearing through vegetation and instantly dropping advancing soldiers in their tracks, entirely neutralizing the momentum of a bayonet charge. Equally lethal in the jungle canopy was the Winchester Model 1897 trench shotgun, a weapon that filled Japanese troops with a unique sense of dread. Fitted with a heat shield and a massive 17-inch bayonet lug, this 12-gauge pump-action shotgun fired heavy buckshot shells, each containing 9 lead pellets. In a close-quarters ambush, a single shot from a trench bun delivered the equivalent of a simultaneous rifle volley, spraying a wide cone of destruction that left zero room for evasion. Japanese after-action reports repeatedly highlighted the horror of encountering shotguns that swept the jungle like small cannons, capable of wiping out entire multi-man assault elements in 2 cycles of the pump. When the fight devolved into absolute proximity, where even a submachine gun was too bulky to aim, the raiders drew weapons crafted specifically for lethal hand-to-hand combat. Primary among these was the Marine Raider Stiletto, a sleek, double-edged knife designed by Lieutenant Colonel Clifford H. Shuey, directly inspired by the British Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. Forged from high-grade steel with a razor-sharp point, the stiletto was engineered specifically for silent thrusting into vital areas. Japanese night infiltrators, accustomed to having the absolute advantage in blade warfare, suddenly found themselves being stalked by men carrying weapons designed solely for quiet, efficient throat-cutting and silent takedowns in the dark. Beyond small arms and blades, the raiders altered the math of close combat through their aggressive, specialized deployment of high-explosive force at point-blank range. Every raider rifleman carried an unusually high complement of Mk2 defensive fragmentation grenades, nicknamed pineapple grenades for their grooved cast-iron bodies. In the dense jungle, where sight lines were often limited to mere yards, throwing an Mk2 grenade was far faster and safer than stepping out into the open to engage with a rifle. When Japanese Marines attempted to set up hidden machine gun nests or gather in hollows to organize a bayonet charge, raiders would toss fragmentation grenades silently over the foliage. The resulting burst tore through brush and shattered soft tissue, turning natural cover into lethal shrapnel traps. To further saturate the battlefield with high explosives, Raider units relied heavily on the Browning automatic rifle and light mortar teams, integrating them directly into the front lines of small unit skirmishes rather than holding them back in support roles. A Raider squad did not simply wait for an attack, they created a continuous, overlapping wall of fire that eliminated the spaces where Japanese shock troops traditionally regrouped. Captured Japanese battle logs and diary entries recovered from Guadalcanal and New Georgia reveal a deep, unsettling realization of this reality. One Japanese Navy officer wrote shortly before his position was overrun, "The enemy does not engage in honorable rifle fire. They flood every bush with automatic bullets and explosive iron before we can draw our swords. To charge them is not to fight, it is to enter a grinder." This relentless application of close-range firepower completely broke the psychological foundation of Japanese close combat doctrine. The Imperial Marine was trained to believe that once distance was closed, the Western soldier would panic and fall victim to superior martial discipline. Instead, closing the distance against a raider unit meant entering a dense zone of shotgun pellets, .45 caliber rounds, fragmenting iron, and lethal steel blades. What was intended to be the Japanese Army's ultimate weapon, the surprise hand-to-hand night charge, had turned into a predictable vector for total squad annihilation.
The tactical dominance achieved by the U.S. Marine Raiders completely shattered the invincibility myth surrounding the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces. The Pacific Jungle, which Imperial Command had envisioned as the ultimate theater for Bushido-driven close combat, had instead become a graveyard for their most highly trained naval shock troops. By the conclusion of the Solomon Islands campaign, the realization that U.S. forces would not break under the psychological terror of a bayonet charge forced a profound and agonizing reassessment within the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese military apparatus. Axis after-action analyses from late 1943 onward revealed a stark, cold acknowledgement of the tactical superiority of the American Raider model. Japanese analysts noted with alarm that their traditional emphasis on the spiritual power of the blade was utterly insufficient against a decentralized, fire-saturated combat doctrine. Field reports explicitly warned that attempting to engage the Marines in fluid, short-range night skirmishes or open hand-to-hand combat resulted in unsustainable attrition rates among veteran non-commissioned officers and specialized troops. The hunter had been completely outmatched in the dark, forcing the Imperial military to abandon aggressive night infiltration maneuvers as a primary offensive strategy. This profound tactical shift led directly to the defensive doctrines seen later in the war on islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Recognizing that close-quarters offensive charges against Marine units were entirely suicidal, the Japanese command ordered a total abandonment of the banzai charge. Instead, troops were instructed to dig deep into the earth, constructing massive, interlocking subterranean bunker networks and tunnel systems. The strategy shifted from trying to overwhelm the American soldier with psychological aggression and cold steel to a brutal war of attrition conducted from behind feet of reinforced concrete and volcanic rock, deliberately avoiding close-range infantry encounters whenever possible. Ultimately, the brief but violent operational history of the U.S. Marine Raiders proved that raw aggressiveness and traditional blade doctrine could be utterly dismantled by flexible tactics and overwhelming close-range firepower. The Raiders did not merely survive the horrors of jungle warfare, they mastered them, rewriting the rules of amphibious reconnaissance and special operations. For the Axis soldier entrenched in the Pacific, it wasn't just the guns, planes, or tanks that were terrifying. It was the Allied ingenuity they could never predict.